What's up, guys? I'm Shawnthebro. We are here for another episode of the Fighting Game Tutorial, and this time we are going to go over dynamic spawning. That way you can spawn different characters from different classes in spawn points you set up throughout the level. We are also going to go over, and now that we have our players 1 and 2 set, we can fix the character HUD creation and the hitbox creation that we mentioned in the last few episodes. So to get started, we can go to our code class, and if you go to your fighter template game mode.h, I added a pointer for player 1 and player 2. These view properties are ones we've already gone over, so basically this is just making it available to Blueprint. But this is something new that you've never seen before. So this is a class instance pointer. So this class instance is just the name. It's a variable type. It's the name of whatever the fighter type is that you want to use. So in this case, fighter template character is my default character. So when I'm making a variable here, I'm keeping a reference to player 1. I'm using the base class fighter template character as opposed to mutant character, which we'll be creating later in this episode, because we want it to work for any character that the player chooses to use here. This is basically just used to keep track of data and references for player 1 and player 2, or for character 1, character 2, however you want to think of it. So this thing, this little asterisk, is declaring this as a pointer type. So a pointer type is basically, it's just 4 bytes, and what it does is it keeps a reference to an object. So in this case, we're keeping a reference to a fighter template character object. You could technically do it without a pointer. Unreal will have some issues with that because they don't like you creating class instances that aren't by reference by using a pointer. So you would have to fight around that if you don't decide to use a pointer, but a pointer is a lot more convenient memory-wise and speed-wise. You just have to be a little bit more careful when using it. Because your game will crash if this value is null or empty and you haven't set it to anything and you try to use it. So be careful with that. We'll practice some good memory management later on when we're actually using this. For now, all you need to do is create them. We can work on making it cleaner and nicer in another episode. So that's all that we're going to do as far as code goes for now. Most of this is going to be blueprints this time because it's going to be a default game mode BP that I made that's going to be doing a lot of the spawning logic and things like that. So normally when you make a level in any game type, you will put spawn points for your players because, say you're playing Halo, you need to have spawn points for the character to go back to when they die or when they first load into the level. In terms of the fighting game, we only really need it when they first load into the level or when they end up restarting a round. So you'll see I have a third character here. This third character is just to show you, be able to move around the map a little bit and show you that the spawning is working. The reason I haven't possessed one of the 2 players that you see in front of me is because pawn possession is actually a little bit different than just spawning the characters. And I didn't want to pack too much into one episode, especially since we're new to the pointers and it's going to require some pointer operations. So ignore the little mannequin guy. The important part is the 2 mutants that we're spawning. So there's a few things you're going to need here. So in your level, Unreal has a nice player start thing, which we already discussed in some earlier episodes. But you can either drag this from the side or copy one that's already in your scene. You'll see these things that are player start tags. If you see, it's down here under object. Player start tags are basically just a label that gets put on the player start. That way you can differentiate what objects are supposed to spawn there or what spawn point this is for. So, for example, I made a default game mode BP. So all that was add new blueprint class and then game mode. Fighter template game mode is what I use, but it's your default game mode. Probably not game mode base. You want to have some overridden functionality within the game mode itself, as you saw in the C++ we were just looking at. So just make a child of this class, and that's all this is. Of course, it'll be empty when you start, but I just wanted to add a little bit of logic that sets up the spawning and also sets our players, because once we set our players, we no longer have to deal with that, oh, player controller index 0, and we don't actually have any sort of multiplayer functionality. When we set our players, we can start determining who's who and which players are doing what. That's going to be very useful down the line, and of course it'll help us get rid of a lot of ugly code and blueprint logic. Okay, so in the event graph, on the begin play, we only need to do this once. We can also apply the same logic, minus some of these things. We don't need to do all of this, but we can apply some of this logic when a round ends if we want to reset them back to their default positions on the map. So what we're doing is we're getting all actors of class player start. Now, as you can see in the level, and probably in all your levels, especially in a fighting game, there's only going to be about 2 player starts. 3 in this case, literally because we didn't get to the possession yet, but this would be removed the next time we go through this and actually go over possession. So you can keep the player start tag on if you decide to put in a third one, so that way you can move around and still see that the spawning is working. You can leave the player start tag as none. It's not important. For the other 2, I called it P1, P2. It doesn't matter what you call them. They're not useful in any way to Unreal itself. They can determine logic. So in our case, we're going to use it to determine which one is player 1, which one is player 2. That sounds simple enough. The only thing to be concerned about here is if you do have more than just 2, for example, if you have a story mode and you need like a bunch of enemies coming at you and you need them to come from a player start, you might need to add some additional logic, or what you could do is actually group them under like a P3, and if they're P3, just perform different logic altogether. So this won't break anything if you need more than 2 spawns, but you might have to add additional things if you want more functionality. So if we go in here, we're just getting all actors of the player start class, like I said. So that'll only be 2 normally. It'll be P1 and P2. We're going to loop through them. And I wrote a function called spawn players. To make a new function blueprint, you just hit this little plus function button on the left-hand side. And then in spawn players, I had it, let's go over this real quick. I had it so that it takes in a actor object reference. And I did that so that I can pass the player start actor into this function, because we're going to need it for some things we do inside of it. So you can always add an input on the right-hand side when you're over the spawn player, or something neat you can also do is if you have a variable type that you want to add to a function, input or output, you can actually apply it to the bottom here, and it would go into it. So I already have this done here, which is this object, but let's see. So like we could probably do it from here. There you go. So if you were to drag something to this output where I don't already have this Boolean in there, you can add pin to node, and then it'll add another output input condition there. So that's not necessary, but it is just a nice little hotkey you can use. So in spawn players, we're going to cast to the player start class, because the player start tag from the player start class is a little bit touchy, and we can't just search for get all actors with tag like you might think. So don't do this. Don't do this. If you see there's this get all actors of class with tag, you would think this would work if you just put in your tag. It doesn't, because the player start tag is, for whatever reason, a totally different tag. That's Epic's fault, and honestly just really bad design. So you can ignore that, but make sure that you know that won't work. So don't accidentally use that. Make sure you cast your object, that's the object from the for loop here, to a player start. It's a default Unreal type, so it won't give you any issues. And then just drag off a player start and type in player start tag. There you go, and get player start tag. So this will get you whatever is in this box right here. So we know we're either going to have P1, P2, or none. We only care for P1 and P2. So we can just check, is P1 equal to our player start tag? If it is, we want to spawn a character. Now, when we come from a character select screen, we're going to want to spawn a specific character based on logic within the game. Since we don't have that set up yet, you can hard code one. I'm using the mutant character for player 1. But this is essentially whatever class you want to spawn. So we want to spawn the mutant character, or you can go ahead and spawn any of the other characters you have. The get actor transform is the transform of the player start. This is actually really important because if you don't have this, they won't spawn at the player start. And that's kind of the whole point of the spawn point, is to spawn them there. So it wouldn't really make sense to not have this. So make sure you drag off of the actor with the player start, which is, again, this element from the for loop. Or you could do it from the casted element. It doesn't matter. Get the actor transform and just pass it into the actor transform when you're spawning the actor, just like we did for the hitbox stuff. And then lastly, set this to be player 1. Player 1 is the code variable that we made earlier, the pointer. We're not going to do anything with this now. We will do something with it in the HUD to make that a little bit nicer, and the hitboxes later. But now you don't have to worry about any other additional functionality. This is just setting it so that later when we have different functions to fill out in the game mode, we will know who's player 1 and player 2. This will help especially with possession, so controlling the different pawns, and giving input to different pawns as well. So if we have 2 input devices, like 2 controllers, or a keyboard and controller, we'll be able to tell who's who. And then lastly, this little bit of logic right here is just checking if the player start tag is equal to P2, which is player 2, if it's not equal to P1. If it's equal to P1, it's just going to go spawn this, but if it's not, check if it's P2, spawn it again, and set player 2. You could do this as one block if you wanted, instead of 2 separate functions, or 2 separate, like you could use these 2 nodes for each case, but I wanted to split it up just so we could set player 2 as well. And also, since we're hard coding as opposed to grabbing the value from, for example, a character select screen or something like that, it's easier to tell which one is which. So in this case, let's use a different one just to show it off. So we can use the side scroller character. And if we see that, then you'll notice we actually have a side scroller character and the mutant spawning in. So that logic will be dynamic in the future. We don't have it yet, but you can see that that's working. So lastly, once that loop is completed, I decided to change the HUD creation from the level blueprint. So I have this open. If you see, remember we were doing this in level blueprint where you were seeing the HUD and creating it, and I said it wasn't that great of a spot. It's not that great of a spot. You shouldn't have it per level or per any sort of condition. If you want the HUD to pop up on all your levels, or most of your levels, if you have edge cases, that's fine. But if you want it to be like a standard thing, you should probably take it away from this. You can go ahead and put it right in here. So right when the loop is done, we only want to do it once. We don't want to create multiple HUDs. We can still use player controller 0 here because the owner doesn't really matter in this case. We need references to both player 1 and player 2, so it's not going to matter if player 1 owns it or player 2 owns it. I chose player 1 because if you're doing any sort of story mode stuff where there's not always going to be 2 fighters, you don't want to have any sort of reliance on that second fighter. So just create it, add it to the viewport. Okay. 2 more things. So in the character HUD itself, remember we were also doing the player controller 0 logic to get the health bars, and one of my health bars was actually blank, the one on the right, because it didn't have a player 2 to get health from. Well, now that we have player 1 and player 2 set, we actually can fix that issue. If you go back to our bindings, so if you don't know where this is, if you go to designer, you can click on a progress bar. These are just progress bars. Go to %bind, and then I have health bar 1. Those are default Unreal names, but basically this is player 1, this is player 2. It's their health bar. So in the binding for it, it'll make a function when you hit that and bring you right to it. So it'll bring you to this, for example. It'll just be this function call and this return node. What we're going to do is now get our new game mode, which we're going to set as our default game mode BP. Don't worry, we will set that as our default. But here it is. That's what this was. We're going to get it and cast it to that type. that new class we just made. We're going to grab player 1 or player 2, depending on which bar it is. The left one, player 1, the right one, player 2, and then get the player health, and then put it into the return node. This way we're not doing some random logic on like the single player or the first player controller. Okay, lastly, I made a mutant character BP. So this character BP doesn't really have anything in it, but it's kind of important to make this and the C++ class, because when you make different fighters, even if you want them to have pretty much the same functionality, if you need them to have different movesets or different, like I know some games, especially like the Tekken games, have a lot of really specific cases for their fighters. If that's the case, you obviously don't want one class, our default fighter template class, to handle everything. So even if you don't plan on overriding it, for the future, it would be really good if you did. So I'd recommend pretty heavily to just make it add new C++ class, go off of your fighter template class, or fighter template character in my case. Make that, it'll look like this. I did not add anything to either of these. So you can see you don't have to do anything here for now, but it's good to have them that way. If you need to add any functionality for just the mutant or just the base character, that way you can have that and not affect all your other characters. And then lastly, and this is what I was looking at before, if you want to add a child to that, add a blueprint class, you can go in here and go to your fighting, your mutant character right here, and just make a child of that. And this will be nothing, obviously, when you go in here. It'll be like a little circle as the default mesh. So then you just go over here to the left, create mesh, or click on mesh, and then you can set your anim class and your skeletal mesh, which are things we already have if you watch the other episodes. If not, you just click down on this and you can pick whatever one you want. So I can change it to something else like mannequin, but for this one specifically, I want to make it the mutant. So the whole reason I'm doing this part right here is, so the code was for the different functionality. The blueprint is to have the mesh set up. You could have one character and change the mesh depending on an enum or an integer or some boolean or something like that. But it's much easier to just make a character blueprint for each class that has the mesh and anim BP already attached to it, and then just spawn that child class of the base character when a character has been chosen. So hopefully that makes sense. But if not, basically this is really good practice to have a separate character, code class, so CPP and header file, and a separate character BP for all your characters. It'll become more relevant later on as we do more functionality with them. So don't worry if that doesn't make a lot of sense right now. So then that's everything for the actual tutorial, but there are some things we should do just to be able to test this more easily. So if you go into your project settings, edit project settings, maps and modes, this should probably be game mode or game mode base by default, but change it to your new game mode BP. You could make it the code class, but we haven't done anything in the code class, so there's no real point to doing that. Also, I'm not sure if it'll work without binding it to the BP class first. So to be on the safe side for this part of the tutorial, just use the blueprint class that you made. And then lastly, for your default pawn class, you can change this if you want. Since I haven't got into switching the characters that spawn and possessing them, we're just setting where they spawn and what classes spawn. You don't have to change this, but you can feel free to change this to whatever character you want. If you change this to mutant character or fighter template character, instead of being the mannequin in the middle, and I'll just show you, it's going to be this guy. That third guy that spawns. He will be a little screwed up because he's not really meant to be right here. This is just the default pawn class that's set to spawn in Unreal by default. So he won't have any proper functionality, but you can feel free to use that if you want, just as a little side note. Okay, the very last thing. Local multiplayer for me was checked. You'll definitely want to turn this off before next episode, and I'll bring this up next time too. But you don't want to use split screen in a fighting game, obviously, because if you do, then when you have 2 inputs, 2 controllers, you're going to have 2 screens, and you want it all to be on the same. So just make sure this is unchecked. I figured I'd bring it up while we're in the project settings. I think that's about it. I know last time we talked about getting into the character select screen, so that will be the next episode. And we will work on the possession of the pawns so you can play with multiple characters as well. Anyway, guys, I hope you enjoyed. I'm Shawnthebro. If this video helps you, please subscribe. It helps me out a ton, and I really appreciate it. And then feel free to check out my Discord as well. I'll leave an iCard in the top right here. A lot of people have been asking more specific questions, and I've been able to help them on there. So feel free to join that, and I'll give you some help and talk to you in person, which would be nice. And then, yeah, that's it, guys. That's all I got. So I won't see you again before the holidays, so Merry Christmas, Happy Holidays, and I'll see you next episode, guys.